March 21, 1918, 4:40 in the morning. The Somme Valley, France. For 5 hours the earth itself seemed to scream. Over 6,000 German artillery pieces unleashed the most concentrated bombardment in human history up to that point. Nearly 1,000,000 shells in the opening salvo alone. The ground liquefied. Men went mad from the noise. And then, through the fog and poison gas, came 750,000 German soldiers in the largest offensive the Western Front had ever seen. Operation Michael. The Kaiser's gamble. Germany's last desperate throw of the dice before American forces could arrive in overwhelming numbers. Within 48 hours, the German advance had punched through British lines, advancing up to 40 miles in some sectors. The fastest movement on the Western Front since 1914. Towns that had been safely behind British lines for years suddenly found themselves under German artillery fire. Field hospitals were overrun. Ammunition dumps captured. And in the chaos, something even more catastrophic was unfolding. Something that threatened to accomplish what 4 years of trench warfare had not. The complete collapse of the British Expeditionary Force. Not from lack of courage, not from lack of men, but from something far more prosaic and far more deadly. The railways were failing. The intricate web of steel that kept 500,000 British soldiers fed, armed, and supplied was being systematically severed. Branch lines captured, junction stations shelled into rubble, the main arterial routes choked with refugees and retreating units. Within days, British forces would begin to starve. Not of food, but of the 12,000 tons of ammunition, equipment, medical supplies, and reinforcements they consumed every single day. The German High Command knew this. They were counting on it. Ludendorff's plan wasn't just to break the British line. It was to break the British supply system, to create such chaos in the rear areas that even units still holding the front would wither and die from lack of shells, bullets, and hope. In London, the War Office received the reports with mounting horror. The situation was deteriorating faster than anyone had predicted, and standing between total disaster and survival was a hastily assembled group of men who had never fired a shot in anger. Civilian railway engineers, dock workers with calloused hands and decades of experience moving cargo, retired managers from the Great Western Railway who had been enjoying their pensions just days before. They had no military training, no experience working under shellfire, but they had something the British Army desperately needed. They knew how to make trains run, and in March 1918, that knowledge would prove more valuable than a division of fresh troops. The scale of the catastrophe became clear within 72 hours of the German attack. Albert Geddes, a 52-year-old former station master from Swindon, stood in what remained of the railway junction at Péronne and tried to comprehend what he was seeing. The station didn't exist anymore. Not really. The main building was a skeleton of blackened brick. The platforms had been cratered by shells. Most critically, the tracks themselves, the steel arteries that had carried thousands of tons of supplies forward to the British lines, were twisted into abstract sculptures by German artillery. Geddes had been recalled from retirement 3 days earlier. The telegram had been terse: report immediately to Dover. Emergency railway operations. France. He had assumed it was administrative work, coordinating schedules, managing manifests. The sort of thing a man with 30 years of railway experience could do in his sleep. Instead, he found himself standing in a war zone, watching the entire British supply system unravel in real time. The numbers were staggering. Before the German offensive, The British Expeditionary Force had relied on a network of rail lines that moved approximately 12,000 tons of supplies daily from the Channel ports to forward dumps behind the front lines. Ammunition alone accounted for nearly half that tonnage. An 18-pounder field gun, the workhorse of British artillery, could fire 20 rounds per minute in sustained action. Multiply that by hundreds of guns, factor in machine gun ammunition, rifle cartridges, trench mortar bombs, grenades, and the consumption was astronomical. The railways had handled it all with industrial efficiency. Trains ran on precise schedules. Supplies flowed forward like clockwork. Until March 21st. Now, the main rail corridors were either under German control or under such heavy shell fire that running trains was suicidal. The junction at Amiens, absolutely critical to British logistics, was within range of German guns. Trains were being hit on the platforms, locomotives destroyed. The secondary lines that might have taken up the slack were choked with refugees, retreating units, and the general chaos of an army in crisis. At forward positions, ammunition stocks were being consumed at catastrophic rates. British gunners were firing every shell they had, trying to slow the German advance. Within days, some batteries would be down to their last few rounds, and when the shells ran out, the infantry would be left to face German stormtroopers with nothing but rifles and bayonets. The War Office convened an emergency meeting. Senior officers argued over maps. Some advocated for a fighting retreat to more defensible positions. Others insisted on holding at all costs, but one voice cut through the debate. Sir Eric Geddes, the Director General of Transportation, and coincidentally Albert Geddes's distant cousin, was a railway man who had been given a military title. He understood logistics in a way that career soldiers often didn't. His assessment was brutal and precise. The British Expeditionary Force had perhaps 5 days of supplies at current consumption rates, maybe 7 if they rationed ammunition. After that, units would begin to collapse not from German pressure, but from simple lack of materiel. Retreating wouldn't solve the problem. The main rail lines were compromised regardless of where the front line was drawn. The only solution was to completely reroute the supply network, to abandon the primary rail corridors and instead push supplies through secondary coastal ports, then construct new temporary rail connections to reach forward dumps. It was an audacious plan, possibly an insane plan. It would require building rail infrastructure under fire, using whatever materials could be scrounged. It would mean running trains on tracks that hadn't seen regular service in years, using locomotives that had been mothballed as obsolete. And it would all have to be done by civilians, because every trained soldier was needed at the front. Sir Eric looked at the assembled officers and said something that would become legendary among British railway workers. We built the Great Western Railway across England in the 1830s with nothing but picks, shovels, and determination. We'll build whatever we need in France the same way. The call went out across Britain. Railway engineers, dock workers, freight handlers, mechanics who knew steam locomotives, anyone with experience in industrial logistics. Hundreds responded. Some were motivated by patriotism. Others by the generous pay being offered. Many were simply men who had spent the war feeling useless, watching younger men go to France while they stayed behind because they were too old or too specialized to be soldiers. Now they had their chance to serve. Albert Geddes arrived at Calais on March 26, 1918. The port was chaos, wounded men being evacuated. Supplies stacked in massive piles because there was no way to move them forward, and everywhere the sound of distant artillery. The Germans were 40 miles away and advancing. Geddes was assigned to a team of 30 men. Their mission was simple to state and nearly impossible to execute. They needed to establish a new supply route from Calais to forward dumps near Arras, bypassing the compromised main lines entirely. This meant using a combination of coastal branch lines, some of which hadn't seen regular traffic in a decade, and constructing entirely new rail spurs to bridge gaps in the network. They had no detailed maps of the secondary lines, no certainty that the tracks were even intact, and they needed to have trains running within 72 hours. The team included men from across Britain's railway network. There was Thomas Hewitt, a dock foreman from Liverpool who could organize cargo loading with mathematical precision. James McAllister, a Scottish engineer who had designed rail bridges for the Caledonian Railway. Young Peter Ashworth, barely 19, who had lied about his age to join the effort because his father had been a locomotive driver and he had grown up around trains. They were joined by a contingent of French railway workers who knew the local lines, and a handful of Belgian refugees who had worked on the railways before the German invasion of 1914. Communication was a mixture of broken French, hand gestures, and the universal language of men who understood steel, steam, and schedules. Their first task was reconnaissance. They needed to survey the coastal branch line from Calais to Etaples, a route that had primarily been used for local passenger traffic before the war. Geddes led a team in a commandeered truck, driving north along roads clogged with military traffic. What they found was both encouraging and terrifying. The tracks existed. In some places they were in decent condition. In others they were overgrown with weeds, the ballast washed out, the rails rusted. There were sections where the track bed had subsided, places where bridges looked questionable, and all of it was within potential range of German long-range artillery, but it was possible, barely. McAllister did rapid calculations in a battered notebook. If they could repair the worst sections, if they could find enough serviceable locomotives, if they could establish loading procedures at Calais and unloading points near the front, they could move perhaps 3,000 tons per day on this route alone. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but it was a start. They returned to Calais and began working. The British Army provided what it could: work crews, some engineering equipment, raw materials. But much of what they needed simply didn't exist in sufficient quantities. Rails had to be scavenged from abandoned sidings. Sleepers were pulled from rail yards in Britain and shipped across the Channel. Ballast was quarried from local sites, often under shell fire. The locomotives were a particular problem. The modern, powerful engines were all in use on the main lines. What remained were the obsolete, the worn-out, the retired. Engines that had been built in the 1880s and 1890s. Locomotives that had been destined for scrap yards. They were pulled out of storage, hastily serviced, and pressed into service. Some broke down within hours. Others, miraculously, kept running. Peter Ashworth found himself working 18-hour days maintaining a locomotive that was older than his father. It was a Great Western Railway saddle tank engine, built in 1887, designed for shunting in rail yards. It had been retired in 1915 as worn out. Now it was hauling supply trains through France. The engine leaked steam from a dozen joints. The boiler pressure was unreliable. The brakes were marginal, but Ashworth nursed it along with constant adjustments, improvised repairs, and what he later described as prayer and profanity in equal measure. The work was relentless. Teams worked around the clock, sleeping in shifts in whatever shelter they could find. Meals were eaten standing up. There was no time for rest. Every hour of delay meant British soldiers at the front were firing their last shells, facing German attacks with dwindling ammunition. By March 29th, they had the coastal route partially operational. The first supply train departed Calais at 3:00 in the morning, a string of ancient freight wagons pulled by two wheezing locomotives, carrying 200 tons of artillery shells. It was a fraction of what was needed, but it was moving. The real challenge was getting supplies from the coastal route to the forward dumps. The existing rail network had gaps, places where the tracks simply didn't connect to where they needed to go. The solution was to build new rail spurs, temporary lines constructed with whatever materials were available, designed to last just long enough to get through the crisis. Thomas Hewitt led the construction of the first spur, a 3-mile extension that would connect the coastal line to a forward dump near Arras. His crew consisted of 50 men. Railway workers, soldiers on temporary assignment, and local French civilians. They had basic tools and a collection of rails that didn't quite match. The work was brutal. The ground in northern France in March was mud. Not ordinary mud, but the thick, clinging, soul-destroying mud that had characterized the Western Front for 4 years. Digging foundations for sleepers meant working waist-deep in freezing water. Rails had to be manhandled into position, each one weighing hundreds of pounds, and all of it was done within earshot of the front lines. German artillery was a constant presence. The crew learned to recognize the different sounds. The distant thump of guns firing, the whistle of shells in flight, the earth-shaking crump of impact. They developed an informal warning system. Someone would shout incoming, and everyone would drop whatever they were holding and dive for the nearest shell hole or ditch. Then, when the barrage passed, they would climb out, assess the damage, and resume work. On April 2nd, a German shell landed directly on a section of track they had just completed. 3 men were killed instantly. 2 more were wounded. The rails were torn up, the sleepers shattered. Hewitt stood looking at the crater and felt something close to despair. They had worked for 36 hours straight to lay that section. Now it was gone, but there was no time for grief. No time for despair. The wounded were evacuated. The dead were covered with tarpaulins to be dealt with later, and the crew began rebuilding the destroyed section. They worked through the night, using lanterns shielded to avoid attracting German fire. By dawn, the track was operational again. It wasn't pretty. The rails were slightly misaligned. The grade was steeper than ideal, but a locomotive could traverse it, and that was all that mattered. The first supply train rolled across the new spur on April 4th. Hewitt watched it pass, a string of wagons loaded with ammunition, moving at perhaps 10 miles per hour over the improvised track. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, but the challenges kept mounting. The locomotives were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. The ancient engines simply weren't designed for the workload. Boilers failed. Axles cracked. Drive rods bent under stress. Mac Allister established a field workshop in an abandoned factory near Calais. His team performed miracles of improvisation. When replacement parts weren't available, they fabricated them. Boiler tubes were patched with whatever metal could be found. Bearings were recast using molds made from sand and clay. One locomotive had its damaged drive wheels replaced with wheels from a completely different engine, requiring the crew to machine new mounting points using hand tools. The work was dangerous. Steam locomotives operate under immense pressure. A boiler failure could kill everyone nearby, but the alternative was to let the locomotives sit idle, and that was unacceptable. Mac Allister himself was nearly killed when a boiler he was inspecting suddenly vented steam. He was saved only because he had developed a habit of standing to the side of any engine he was working on, never directly in front. The blast of superheated steam missed him by inches. He was back at work within an hour, his hands bandaged but his determination unshaken. By mid-April, the improvised supply network was moving approximately 5,000 tons per day. It still wasn't enough. The British forces were consuming supplies faster than they could be delivered, but it was enough to keep fighting, enough to prevent collapse. At forward positions, British gunners received their shells, not in abundance, not with any margin for error, but enough to keep firing, enough to make the Germans pay for every yard they advanced. The German offensive was beginning to slow, not because of any single dramatic defeat, but because of the grinding arithmetic of logistics. The German forces had advanced so far, so fast, that their own supply lines were stretched to breaking. They were trying to haul supplies across the devastated landscape of the old Somme battlefield, a moonscape of shell craters and destroyed infrastructure. Meanwhile, the British, despite the crisis, were managing to maintain their supply flow. Barely, desperately, but maintaining it nonetheless. The civilian railway workers became a legend among the troops. Soldiers at the front would see the supply trains arriving and marvel that they were running at all. The locomotives were ancient, wheezing things that looked like they belonged in a museum. The tracks they ran on were often visible from German positions, making them targets, but they kept coming. Albert Geddes, standing at a forward dump near Arras on April 15th, watched as a supply train arrived under shellfire. The locomotive was one he recognized, an old engine from Swindon that he had worked on decades earlier. It was pulling 12 wagons of artillery shells, moving at a crawl because the track was so rough. German shells were landing 200 yards away, walking closer with each salvo. The train didn't stop. It couldn't stop. Stopping meant the supplies wouldn't reach the guns, and the guns had to keep firing. The locomotive crew, two men who Geddes later learned were a father and son team from Wales, drove their engine through the barrage with what could only be described as insane courage. The train reached the unloading point. Work crews swarmed the wagons, unloading shells with frantic speed. 15 minutes later, the train was heading back, empty wagons rattling, the locomotive leaving a trail of black smoke. Geddes learned later that the locomotive had taken shrapnel damage. 3 wagons had been holed, but the crew had delivered their cargo. The pattern repeated dozens of times each day. Trains running on impossible schedules over improvised tracks, crewed by men who had never expected to be heroes. The work took a toll. Men collapsed from exhaustion and were carried to aid stations, given a few hours of sleep, and then returned to work. Injuries were common. The improvised rail spurs were dangerous even without German artillery. Derailments happened. Men were crushed between wagons, scalded by steam, but they kept working. By late April, the German offensive had definitively stalled. The Kaiser's gamble had failed. The British lines had bent but not broken. And while historians would later credit the resilience of British infantry, the arrival of French reinforcements, and the tactical errors of German commanders, those who were there knew another truth. The battle had been won in rail yards and on improvised tracks. It had been won by men with wrenches and hammers, by obsolete locomotives kept running through sheer determination, by civilian workers who had done the impossible because there was no alternative. The final accounting was staggering. Between March 21st and the end of April, the improvised railway network moved over 180,000 tons of supplies. Not as much as the original network would have handled, but enough. Enough to keep British guns firing. Enough to bring forward reinforcements. Enough to prevent the collapse that the German High Command had been counting on. The human cost was significant. 23 civilian railway workers were killed, most by German artillery. Over 100 were wounded. Dozens more were injured in industrial accidents. They received no medals, no parades. When the crisis passed, most simply went back to their regular jobs, their service noted in terse official reports and nowhere else. But their impact was undeniable. Military historians later calculated that without the improvised supply network, British forces would have been forced to retreat by early April, potentially all the way to the Channel ports. The political consequences would have been catastrophic. The French government might have sought a separate peace. The war could have ended in German victory. Instead, the British held. And when the German offensive finally exhausted itself, the British and French were able to counterattack. The 100 Days offensive that began in August 1918 would drive the German army back and ultimately win the war. But it was only possible because of what happened in March and April, because a group of civilian railway workers had done the impossible. The locomotives they used were mostly scrapped after the war. The temporary rail spurs were torn up, the materials salvaged. The men who had built and operated them returned to civilian life. Albert Geddes went back to his retirement in Swindon. Thomas Hewitt returned to the Liverpool docks. James McAllister resumed his work designing bridges in Scotland. Peter Ashworth, the young mechanic who had kept ancient locomotives running, eventually became a railway engineer himself, though he never spoke much about his time in France. The official histories of the Great War mention the logistics crisis of March 1918 in passing, usually in footnotes. The focus is on the battles, the generals, the grand strategy. But those who understand warfare know the truth. Wars are not won solely by the bravery of soldiers or the genius of commanders. They are won by the unglamorous, exhausting, absolutely critical work of keeping armies supplied. By the men who build railways under fire, who keep locomotives running when they should have failed, who work 18-hour days in the mud and the cold because soldiers they will never meet are depending on them. In March 1918, Britain's railway network faced catastrophic collapse. A group of civilian workers, armed with nothing but expertise and determination, prevented that collapse. They didn't charge enemy positions. They didn't fly fighter planes or command divisions. They laid track, repaired locomotives, and moved supplies. And in doing so, they changed the course of history. The lesson remains relevant today. In any conflict, in any crisis, the decisive factor is often not the dramatic action, but the sustained, grinding work of logistics. The ability to move supplies where they are needed when they are needed, regardless of the obstacles. It's not glamorous, it's rarely celebrated, but it is, quite literally, the difference between victory and defeat. The men who saved the British Expeditionary Force in 1918 understood this. They were railway workers, not soldiers, but they were exactly what Britain needed at that moment, and they delivered.